Let's take a look at the Week 9 study questions. This is the second Landsberg reading. Number 1. On page 205, Landsberg says, death comes from an alien sphere and is introduced, as it were, from outside into our existence. Question I asked was, does this mean that death is not natural to us? How could that be? Well, I think this is the most important point in the whole essay, I think. And if you look at where he says that on page 205, it's quite an important section of the essay, because it is where he shows that he fundamentally disagrees with Heidegger. And you'll remember Heidegger from Glenn Gray's essay on death and existentialism, that he is setting out a position, I think, which I think is quite consciously meant to be in opposition, direct opposition to Heidegger's characterization of human existence as a being towards death. Let's take a look at where he says this at the bottom of page 205. Death comes from an alien sphere and is introduced, as it were, from outside into our existence. The spiritual appropriation of death is the supreme task of each human person. But the effort is an acknowledgement of the nature of this death, which has to be transformed. Personal existence is not fatality. Its task is to transform the fatality of death into liberty. You can see his Christianity, his Catholicism is really coming out here. I would say, to me, it just rings very true as a Catholic view of death, that death is this humongous challenge. I just said humongous. Death is this great challenge. Yes, it is a humongous challenge, okay? It is the challenge to the human being, because a human being is an organism that does die. But that this challenge has to be overcome for the sake of spiritual fulfillment. And I take that as to be the Christian view of death. He continues and says, the death of a man was originally similar to the death of a beast. Right before we became persons, before we realized that aspect of our being human, being a person. Amongst primitive peoples, there is still no great difference. It is only in connection with the progressive personalization of the whole of human existence that it really acquires a new significance. This is harking back to what he said in, I guess, section 2, or was it 3? The whole thing about individualization and death, and the awareness of death and the being of an individual person being so closely connected. The acceptance of death transforms death, but this acceptance presupposes a resistance. The human person is not, in its true essence, an existence toward death. Like every other existence after its own fashion, it is a movement towards self-realization and towards eternity. Again, this very Christian view that death is something not to be accepted. Death is not something to be viewed as being natural, because it's not. It's natural to a human being, insofar as a human being is a natural creature just like any other animal. But human beings, once they become persons, become more than that. And that is what makes death a problem for a person, in the way it's not for an animal, something that is mere animal, only an animal. We are not in existence towards death, as Heidegger said, insofar as death is that final boundary situation. Death is something to be overcome in order to attain true self-realization. That is an entirely different point of view. I mean, so how could it be that death is not natural to human beings? Well, death is natural to human beings insofar as they are simply Homo sapiens, members of a species, biological creatures. It couldn't be more natural. But insofar as they're persons, it is not natural. It is not natural for a person to die. A person is something other than the organism that supports it. And the person has to overcome death in order to truly realize itself. So I think that is one of the big outcomes, for me at least, of this essay is that the human predicament with regards to death is that insofar as we are animals, death is quite natural. It's not something that is alien. But insofar as we're persons, death is something alien, something other. That's why it's a threat. Okay, on page 206, Landsberg says, quote, "At the root of all being there is an act, the affirmation of the self." What does he mean by this? That's a good question. Jeez. What page are we on? 205, 206. I'm looking for the quote. It makes sense that it's right here. Yeah, here it is, towards the bottom. Let's back up a little bit. Where he says, right here, he says, "At the very moment that I formulate the thought, I affirm the instinct in the human person to realize and perpetuate itself. At the root of all being, there is an act, the affirmation of the self. In each personality, aware of its uniqueness, we find the affirmation of this uniqueness moving towards its realization, an affirmation which implies the tendency to surpass the limits of time." Now, that last part of it, I think, is what differentiates Landsberg's Landsberg's context for saying that the self affirms itself from, let's say, Hans Jonas's. Because that idea of self-affirmation is a very strong idea in Jonas, in his explanation of what he means by the burden of mortality, and I hope that you see that. But that last part of it, the affirmation which implies the tendency to surpass the limits of time, is an affirmation of survival of death. That is, this affirmation is not a simple affirmation, as in Jonas, to continue to exist from one moment to the next, knowing that death is eventually inevitable. No, the affirmation of the self is a spiritual and transcendental affirmation that, as he says, surpasses the limits of time, which affirms that we are not just biological creatures. We are also, in this paradoxical way, spiritual creatures that demand a victory over death. So, as he says, he continues and says, "Faith in a personal survival is not merely a comforting thought. It is above all the expression, the actual shape given to this ontological factor, this affirmation of the self in this transcendental way, just basically the affirmation of the self as something that survives death, is, Landsberg thinks, built into the structure of our existence, just as Heidegger thought that the existence towards death as finality was built into the structure of our existence." So he's really opposing the Heidegger view here. Number 3, according to Landsberg, how is hope different from expectation? Well, this goes back to what I've just been saying. Hope differs from expectation, he says, insofar as hope has only one content. Hope is only hope for one thing, whereas expectation, you can fill in whatever content you want. I expect the sun to rise tomorrow. I expect the Phillies to win the World Series. I expect to have chicken for dinner, right? But hope is only, he says, has a special meaning, and it's always for one thing. He says hope does, in fact, possess a content, but what it does not possess is a variable content. It possesses only one content. And that hope is always for the continuing being and self-realization of the person after death. That's the one thing that he says hope is really about. Very Christian, right? Very Christian. Number 4, Plato believed in immortality, and Landsberg does as well, it seems. Well, this is not as straightforward as with Plato. But Plato wasn't as straightforward as Plato either. I hope you got that. Yet how do their conceptions differ, and why would Landsberg be prompted to say on page 215 of Plato that to him death remained hidden? I think the answer to that's pretty simple. We can go to page 215, but it comes back to the idea of the person. Plato didn't understand that idea. And he's not to be faulted for that, because no one before Christ, according to Landsberg, understood that idea. That because Plato didn't realize himself or anyone else as a person, because no one did, again. Right? This is something that comes to the human species in history as a result of the appearance of Christ, is that that's what he believes, right? Landsberg believes. So that no one really understood what it meant to be a person before Christ, so no one really understood death. And as a result of that, one of the things that Plato didn't realize about his notion of the immortality of the soul is that no one really wants that. And I hope you understand from looking at it what I mean by that. No one really wants Plato's version of immortality because it lacks individuality, it lacks personhood. It's a generic notion of the afterlife. It's not personalized. The point of survival, of death for the individual, is that I, as the unique person that I am, survive. Whereas what Plato offered was some sort of general, universal, or generic notion of mind or soul that survives. So it's a big point, actually, to understand in Landsberg. Number 5, what does Landsberg mean by the Epicurean sophism of the inexistence of death? Well, I think what he means is that Epicurus, in saying that death is nothing to us because when we are, death is not come, and when death is come, we are not, that this is a way of dismissing in words what cannot be dismissed in reality. That's what Landsberg actually says. The problem of death is a problem for human beings, whether they like it or not. And to say that, well, it's not really a problem because death is the privation of all awareness, and we become nothing at death, so there's no overlap between our experience and death itself. But this is a dismissal of the problem of death without really confronting the issue, which is just that, and this is where Landsberg shares a lot with the existentialists like Heidegger and Jaspers. It's the very threat of becoming nothing itself which inspires the dread, and it's the very threat of becoming nothing itself which is the problem. And so Epicurus, according to Landsberg, was trying to dismiss something without really confronting the reality of it. At the beginning of section 8, Landsberg says the life of man without God is much like a tragedy. How does the description of the bullfight supposedly show us what that tragedy is like? Well, I think it's pretty obvious, that in his allegory, I guess you call it, of the bullfight, human beings are the bull and death is the matador. And without God, that is, without the hope of survival, life is a tragic thing where we're bound to lose the fight, which is exactly what I think Jonas would say and exactly what the existentialists would say. That's why human life really is tragic. So I think Landsberg is saying, it's not tragic, but it's only not tragic because of the promise of survival, and that's the Christian promise for him. Christ as the victor over death in his essential identity. Christ's essential identity, or part of it, is that he is the victor over death. At the end of the essay, page 231, Landsberg says that, quote, death can only be the paradoxical culmination of this inner struggle for existence. What does he mean by this? I haven't looked at that in a while. It's a pretty tough quote there. Let's take a look at it. 231. Let's back up a little bit, where he says, spiritual joy is only a reflection of a movement towards being. It is thus possible to understand death by analogy, but by an analogy which is in no sense arbitrarily chosen. This Stirb und werde, I don't speak German, but he says that is die and become, is shown to be a fact of experience, and death can only be the paradoxical culmination of this inner struggle of existence. I guess maybe I'm, relying here on my Catholic background, listening to liturgy, listening to the Mass and things like that. But, this Christian idea of dying into life is the paradox of the Christian view of death, and also the promise of the Christian view of death. It is a struggle. Death is a great challenge and a great trial, but the idea is that it is a trial that can be overcome through faith, and that the promise is of self-realization, of after death and through death, finally becoming what you were meant to be as a person. So death both as the great challenge and threat and menace, but also that which, if overcome spiritually, it gives us the great promise of self-realization, which could only be had, as he said, transcendentally, beyond the limits of time. This is a great reading. I mean, let's face it, it gets pretty deep.